Good morning and welcome to Asia House. I'm Michael Lawrence, Chief Executive. Welcome to the Middle East Pivot to Asia, which is part of the Asia House Middle East program. Today we will explore the growing and increasingly important relationship between the Middle East and Asia, the deeper ties, the more and more diverse trade, and areas where we see this developing further and rapidly. It's against the backdrop of an increasingly polarized geopolitical picture, the center of which is the escalating tensions between the US and China. Recent research by Asia House showed that trade between the Middle East and Asia has increased sharply over the last 5 years, while in contrast, Middle East trade with OECD countries has slumped, something in the order of 20%. The big players in the region are leading the drive for closer ties between the two. Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited China, Pakistan, and India at the beginning of this year. This followed the historic visit by China's President Xi to the UAE in 2018, during which a whole range of agreements were signed. It was a high-profile and highly significant visit. Today, we'll analyse the future of trade between the Middle East and Asia and its impact on the Middle East relationship with traditional partners in the OECD. We're going to focus as well on two key sectors, technology and energy, specifically renewables and green energy. Technology is a focus of the region. The region has aspirations to become a global tech hub with a young and educated population, as well as one of the world's highest per capita internet penetration levels. There's significant growth potential for digital technologies. But there is, of course, intense competition. Established players like Singapore and London, but also other centres in Asia which share similar aspirations. We'll be looking at technology a little later in the session. We do have one change to the program. We were expecting the Business Development Chief of Careem to be with us this morning. He was unable to make his flight, so he won't be joining us. Apologies for that. But we will be doing a lot on tech, so do stay with us. Now, following the discussion on tech, we'll shift the focus to renewables and clean energies. Asia has, as we know, an enormous need for energy, and of course, the Middle East is a key supplier. But Asia is also a driver of renewable technologies, while the Middle East is a prime region for solar, as well as wind, geothermal, and biomass energy. This sector potentially creates another very strong or even stronger tie between the two regions. We're going to examine the renewables scene and the relationship between Asia and the Middle East a bit later this morning. But to get us underway and to share his views, his insights on the Middle East's pivot to Asia, please welcome to the stage the Chairman of Asia House, Lord Stephen Green.
Michael, thank you very much, and let me add my word of welcome to everybody here. It's a great pleasure always for me to come to Asia House because I not only have the great honour of being the chair of it, but its subject matter is endlessly fascinating for me. And the pivot to Asia of the Middle East is one of the most important phenomena of our times, and I just want to set that in a slightly wider context and then take you through some of the numbers which Michael has alluded to, because there are some dramatic changes underway which affect, in my view, any business strategy for engagement in the Middle East over the next generation, probably. The wider context is, of course, the rise of Asia as an economic powerhouse or a series of economic powerhouses, and the geopolitical implications of the changing population, if I can put it that way, of the world stage. If you go back half a century, let alone further than that, you will see a world dominated firstly, above all, by America, and then by some other European powers. If you go back to the 19th century, of course, it was dominated by European powers entirely. Then they had to make way first for America, or make room first for America, and then for Japan on the world stage. This phenomenon of the rise of Asia can, in my view, best be seen as a historic convergence, which is correcting a global imbalance that started to arise from about 1820 onwards. 1820, the largest economy in the world was China. The second largest economy in the world was India. At that time, the size of your economy relative to the total world economy was roughly the same as your population as a proportion of the world's total population. And of course, then as now, the two largest countries by far were China and India. We all know what happened after that. First the Europeans, then the Americans, and then after into the 20th century, the Japanese started to develop economies which for the first time in human history were able to create a massive surplus over headcount production or subsistence level. And at their peak, that small group of countries, Europe, North America, Japan, produced about 75% of world output on the basis of less than 20% of the world's population. What we are now seeing is that that gap is narrowing. And importantly, China, above all, has shown the way, but it's not in a sense, not the most dramatic example, it's just the biggest one. Similarly, dramatic transformations have taken place in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia, and now increasingly in India too. And you're seeing those countries, Asia collectively, take a larger and larger share of world economic output. That's the general backdrop. And the other fact you need to add into that equation is that all of those economies are short of resources. All of them are in particular short of energy resources. China, Japan, South Korea, India are all big importers of hydrocarbons one way or another. And of course, if you look at the Middle East, what you see is a series of economies that for a long time have been dominated to essentially 99% of their output by hydrocarbons. One or two have begun the process of diversification more broadly, but up until quite recently, the last 10 to 20 years, say, hydrocarbons was the big story of the Middle East, and all of the geopolitics that were associated with that. And we know, I'm sure, enough of our history of the 20th century to know how the Europeans and the Americans and the Russians all played their part in creating a cauldron of instability in so many parts of the Middle East. That story is not entirely finished yet. You continue to see the tragedies of Syria and Libya and other places. You continue to see the difficulty Iran has in deciding what it wants to be and what relations it wants to have with its neighbors over the coming decades. This is still an unsolved enigma of that part of the world. And the underlying and very deep historical tensions between Iran and other parts of the Middle East Muslim world complicate the matter extraordinarily. Nevertheless, the broader truth that is relevant to a business group such as is gathered here today, when you think about both trade patterns and investment patterns, is that there's a big pivot going on. For various reasons, there's a shift of the center of their gravity of their trade from the west to the east. The reasons are partly geopolitical. Sanctions on Iran have certainly shifted the pattern of Iran's trade. Sanctions that are applied very strongly and toughened up by the United States. Unclear whether how much the EU wants to be the United States on their coattails on this. But the general effect, since the Chinese don't care at all, is that there's been a shift of the center of gravity of Iran's trade eastwards. But it's not just Iran. When you look at Saudi Arabia, the top 4 export markets of Saudi Arabia are all Asian countries now. China, India, South Korea, Japan. That wasn't true as recently as 20 years ago, when the US was the top market. But the US has slipped to the 5th. The UK is now down in the teens. The shift of the center of gravity of Saudi trade, which has nothing to do with sanctions, is dramatic. Point number one. And to add to point number one, if you look at the top destination of Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, in all 3 cases, that is now China. This tells you what's going on. It tells you about geopolitical influence, of course. We're not going to dwell much on that today. It certainly tells you about economic impact. And then you look at investment patterns. China has become an increasingly significant investor in a whole range of Gulf countries, in Saudi Arabia itself, in Oman, in the UAE. Michael has already referred to President Xi Jinping's historic visit to the UAE. That wasn't by chance. That's because the Chinese recognize what an important node of contacts and connectivity the UAE is. It does, after all, have, apart from anything else, the world's largest airport in terms of international traffic and passenger flows. So inward investment from the East into the Middle East is growing rapidly. Exports from the Middle East to the Far East are growing rapidly. Both of these things are displacing the importance of the West in the minds of Middle Eastern leaders. And then the other important fact in all of this is that Middle Eastern investment is beginning to play its part in the Belt Road Initiative of China. And the obvious place where you see this dramatically is in a country which is, depending on your point of view, either part of the Middle East or not part of the Middle East, namely Pakistan. In some senses, of course, it's not part of the Middle East. And yet it's increasingly connected with the Middle East in all sorts of ways. And importantly, it's the most obvious concrete example of the outworkings of the Belt Road Initiative, the corridor through Pakistan down to the port of Gwadar, financed strongly by China, developed with a lot of Chinese expertise and advice, is now being invested in by the likes of Saudi Arabia, who have put in $20 billion, I think, into an oil refinery in the port of Gwadar. These are all hugely significant developments. Each single one of them, it's easy to miss when you read them in the Financial Times, but collectively this adds up to a major geopolitical shift. And it will continue, because the core fact that I've already referred to, the fact that the likes of China and India and Japan and South Korea are all short of natural resources in general and of hydrocarbons in particular, means that as they go on growing, and they will do, they are going to demand more and more imports from the Middle East, which is the best placed area to provide it for them. And their geopolitical outlooks tend not to be contaminated by or influenced by any geostrategic questions of the kind that America does preoccupy itself with. So in short, you are going to see more and more trade and more investment flows, and importantly, both ways, between the Middle East and the Far East and South Asia. This is a huge new fact on the drawing board as far as business strategies are concerned. And then there's one final dimension of this, which I think is also important and which Michael has alluded to and which shapes today's program, which is that the Middle East economies are getting less and less totally dependent on oil and gas as their sources of revenue and growth. They are broadening out into more diversified economies, partly by the natural growth of consumer demand and partly by conscious government planning. And so you have seen both the UAE and Saudi Arabia produce vision statements, to use the business school terminology, for the next 10 years. Famously, MBS has led a major vision for the reform and broadening of Saudi Arabia. And even if these visions are only partially implemented, and even if it takes longer than the 2030 horizon that they've set themselves, the direction of travel is clear. There are plenty of challenges to overcome, of course. Typically, with Iran as an important exception to this, but typically those countries have populations that are relatively have shown relatively less propensity to produce literature, to produce books. It is the case that the population of the Middle East, now about 5% of the global population, produces about 1% of the world's literature books. This is a criticism leveled at the region by itself, by Arabs themselves, that this is a major area of development. In other words, education is a big challenge. And clearly, transparency, good governance, openness of regulation, there is plenty of work, as any business person who's done work in that part of the world doesn't need me to tell you, there's plenty of work to do. But the direction of travel is clear. Slowly but surely, and yes, there will be occasional reverses and cul-de-sacs, slowly but surely nevertheless, these economies are going to broaden themselves. This is the aspiration of the Saudis, of the UAE, of Oman, of Qatar, of Iraq. This is the aspiration to create broader societies with broader types of roles, with more opportunities to learn, develop skills, contribute to an economy, create consumer demand. All of this is going to continue to develop. And because the underlying demographics are so strong, these are economies with fast-growing populations, the implications and the opportunities are clear. The big question, of course, is which other countries are going to be the big, most successful winners out of these new opportunities? Is it going to be a relatively slow-growing and rather inward-looking Europe? Is it going to be an America which is making its relations with that part of the world generally more stressful through its sanctions policy and through other measures? Or is it going to be Asia, which seems to be very nimble-footed in exploiting the opportunities? I think it's the latter. I think that Asia is going to see massive opportunities. I think that China's export, well, indeed, you can see it in the numbers, China's exports to Saudi Arabia and other parts of the region are growing very fast. So one way or another, trade, investment, geostrategic considerations are all pointing to a much stronger engagement of Asia in the Middle East and a much stronger engagement of the Middle East in Asia. This is the big theme. The outworkings of this in the energy sector, in the newer sectors, technology, renewables, are clear already. Huawei, just take the story of Huawei. We are all familiar with what the difficulties that Huawei has had in America and in parts of Europe and in Australia and potentially elsewhere. Not a bit of it in the Middle East. It is clear that the Middle Eastern countries intend to be amongst the earliest economies in terms of 5G networking, and it's clear that they're going to use Huawei's expertise in building those up. For all of the difficulties Huawei may have in this part of the world, they are welcome guests in the Middle East. There will be plenty of policymakers in places like America and perhaps in Brussels who are nervous about all the implications of this. I think as businesses, we need to recognize the facts and to see what the implications are for the way we do business in the region and the opportunities that it creates for doing business over the longer term. So that's the agenda for this morning, an agenda which will focus firstly on the pivot to Asia as a strategic phenomenon, and then on technology and on renewables. I guess one final thought is why renewables in the Middle East, an area which is absolutely not short of energy? Well, because, of course, renewables in the shape of solar energy, wind energy, biomass, these are areas in which the Middle East is every bit as well endowed as it is in hydrocarbons. And so there's no good reason to believe that just as the Middle East has got an extraordinarily important role in the world of hydrocarbons, so it can also have an extraordinarily important role in the world of renewables technology. One way or another then, exciting things are happening in the Middle East and in the relationship with the Far East and the rest of Asia, and those are the exciting things that we're going to be focusing on for the next 2 or 3 hours. Thank you very much.